Some people think kindness is weakness until the day it saves a life. The amber glow of neon signs spilled across the polished wood floor of Murphy's Tavern, painting the crowded room in shades of gold and red. Friday night laughter bounced off the walls, mixing with the clink of glasses and the distant hum of a country song drifting from an old jukebox near the corner. Nobody paid much attention to Marcus Reed when he walked in. They rarely did. At 6 feet 2 inches tall and well over 280 pounds, Marcus had spent most of his life being noticed for the wrong reasons. People saw his size before they saw his smile. They noticed his worn jacket before they noticed the groceries he often carried for elderly neighbors. They saw a heavy-set black man sitting alone and assumed they knew his story. Marcus was used to that. He ordered a soda, thanked the bartender, and settled onto a stool near the end of the counter. It had been a long week. His mother's medical appointments had taken up most of his free time, and the quiet hour he planned to spend at the tavern felt like a rare chance to breathe. He stared at the television mounted above the bar, half listening to a baseball game while the noise of the crowd washed around him. Across the room, another group had become the center of attention. Officer Brad Collins sat surrounded by friends, though tonight he wasn't wearing a badge. Even out of uniform, he carried himself like someone who expected every room to belong to him. His voice was loud, his laughter louder. Every story seemed to end with people looking at him for approval before joining in. Several patrons shifted slightly whenever he walked by. It was the kind of respect that looked suspiciously like fear. Brad noticed Marcus after a while. Maybe it was the fact that Marcus sat alone. Maybe it was simply because he looked different from the crowd. Whatever the reason, Brad's eyes lingered longer than they should have. A grin slowly spread across his face. The people around him noticed. One of his friends chuckled before Brad even said a word. Marcus ignored them. Years of experience had taught him that some attention was best left unanswered. He focused on the game, taking a slow sip from his drink. For a few moments, it seemed the evening would continue normally. Then Brad stood up. The room didn't stop moving, but something shifted. Conversations softened just enough for people to notice him crossing the floor. He carried a nearly full cup in one hand and wore the confident expression of someone expecting applause before delivering a joke. Marcus sensed movement and turned slightly. He barely had time to register Brad's shadow before a cold splash cascaded over his head and shoulders. Liquid dripped from his hair, soaked into his shirt, and splattered onto the floor below. The laughter came almost immediately. Not from everyone. Just enough people to make the moment sting. Brad leaned back with a satisfied smile. "People like you should stay outside," he said. For a second, nobody moved. Marcus sat perfectly still. Drops rolled from his forehead and landed on the counter. The baseball game continued on the television as if nothing had happened. Somewhere near the back, a woman lowered her phone. A bartender froze with a towel in his hand. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes. There was no anger in them. No threat. Just a quiet sadness that somehow made the room feel smaller. And before anyone could guess what would happen next, a sudden shout erupted from the parking lot outside. The shout cut through the tavern like a crack of thunder before a storm. Heads turned toward the front windows. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even Brad Collins glanced toward the parking lot, momentarily distracted from the grin that still lingered on his face. Marcus slowly wiped the moisture from his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket and stood from his stool. He did not look at Brad. He did not answer the laughter. He simply turned toward the sound outside. For a moment, nobody followed him. Then curiosity began pulling people from their seats. The bartender set down his towel. A woman near the entrance leaned closer to the glass. Someone whispered that an elderly man had collapsed near the edge of the parking lot. Marcus heard the words, and his pace quickened. The cool night air greeted him as he stepped. Outside beneath the glow of the streetlights. Across the asphalt, a small crowd was already forming. The flashing red sign above Murphy's Tavern reflected off parked cars and puddles left behind by an afternoon rain. Marcus moved quietly toward the gathering. His soaked shirt clung uncomfortably to his shoulders, but he seemed not to notice. People often misunderstood Marcus Reed. They saw his size first. They assumed he moved slowly because he was lazy. They assumed he sat alone because nobody wanted his company. The truth was very different. Marcus had spent nearly 15 years working as an emergency medical technician. For over a decade, he had answered calls in the middle of the night, raced through storms, comforted frightened families, and stood beside strangers on some of the hardest days of their lives. He had never become rich. He had never appeared on television. But there were countless people across the city who were alive because Marcus had shown up when they needed help. 3 years earlier, everything changed. His mother, Evelyn Reed, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. At first it was small things. Forgotten appointments, lost keys, missed birthdays. Then came the days when she no longer remembered familiar streets. Marcus watched the strongest woman he had ever known slowly lose pieces of herself. He made a choice many people did not understand. He left the career he loved and accepted maintenance work with flexible hours so he could care for her. The pay was lower. The work was harder. But every evening, he could be home before sunset. Every morning, he could help her remember where she was. Marcus never regretted the decision. Not once. Most people never learned that story. They never saw the framed commendations stored in a closet. They never knew he once trained younger EMT recruits across the county. They only saw a large black man in an old jacket. As Marcus approached the crowd, a familiar instinct settled over him. The noise around him faded. The embarrassment from inside the tavern faded too. All that remained was focus. Someone needed help. That was enough. Behind him, more patrons spilled from the entrance. Brad Collins stepped outside as well, hands in his pockets, expecting entertainment. What he did not realize was that the man he had mocked only moments earlier was about to reveal a side of himself that nobody in that parking lot had ever seen. The crowd parted almost instinctively as Marcus reached the center of the gathering. An elderly man sat slumped against the side of a pickup truck, his face pale beneath the parking lot lights. A woman knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what had happened to anyone willing to listen. Several people stood nearby offering advice, but nobody seemed certain what to do. Marcus lowered himself carefully beside the man and spoke in a calm, steady voice. The change was immediate. The uncertainty that had filled the air seemed to ease the moment he arrived. Years of experience settled over him like a familiar uniform he no longer wore. He introduced himself, asked simple questions, and listened closely to the answers. The frightened woman explained that the man was her father. They had stopped for dinner while driving back from a family gathering nearly 40 miles away. He had seemed fine inside the restaurant next door, but once they reached the parking lot, he became dizzy and struggled to stay on his feet. Marcus nodded while quietly observing details others overlooked. He noticed the man's breathing pattern. He noticed the slight tremor in his hands. He noticed the medication bracelet partially hidden beneath a shirt cuff. Most importantly, he noticed that panic was spreading faster than the actual emergency. "Everyone take a breath," Marcus said gently. "Help is already on the way." The simple words carried authority without sounding demanding. Several people stepped back. Others stopped talking over one another. Marcus continued speaking to the older man, keeping him focused and comfortable while someone confirmed that emergency services had been called. Near the edge of the crowd, Brad Collins watched with growing confusion. This was not the reaction he expected. The man he had mocked minutes earlier was suddenly the calmest person in the entire parking lot. Nobody was laughing now. Nobody was looking at Brad. There. Attention remained fixed on Marcus. A young woman holding a phone lowered it slightly. "How does he know exactly what to do?" she whispered. The question reached another observer standing nearby. Emily Foster, a local news reporter enjoying a rare night off, studied Marcus carefully. Something about him felt familiar. She knew she had seen that face before, though she could not immediately place it. Then a memory surfaced. Years earlier, she had covered a severe winter storm that overwhelmed emergency responders across the county. One photograph had appeared in nearly every newspaper the following week. It showed a large EMT carrying supplies through waist-deep snow to reach stranded residents. Emily remembered the name beneath the picture. Marcus Reed. Her eyes widened. Meanwhile, Marcus remained focused entirely on the elderly man. He asked about medications, recent meals, and previous health concerns. His voice never rose. His movements remained measured and reassuring. The flashing lights of an approaching ambulance finally appeared in the distance, casting red and white reflections across the parked cars. Relief swept through the crowd. The woman beside her father wiped tears from her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Marcus offered a small smile. "He is going to be okay." Behind him, Emily Foster stared at the soaked jacket still hanging from his shoulders and suddenly realized something else. The crowd had witnessed only part of Marcus Reed's story tonight. The rest of it was far more remarkable than anyone could imagine. The ambulance rolled into the parking lot with its lights flashing across the damp pavement, washing the scene in pulses of red and white. Paramedics stepped out quickly, but the moment they reached the elderly man, one of them paused. He looked at Marcus, then looked again. Recognition flickered across his face. "Marcus Reed?" he asked. Marcus offered a modest nod and stepped aside to give the crew room to work. The paramedic smiled in disbelief. "I trained under you 12 years ago." Several people nearby exchanged surprised glances. The younger medic continued while checking equipment. "Everything I know about staying calm on a scene came from this man." The words hung in the air. For the first time that evening, many of the people standing there began looking at Marcus differently. Not as a stranger, not as the man sitting alone at the end of a bar, but as someone who had quietly spent years helping others. The elderly man was soon stabilized and prepared for transport. Before the ambulance doors closed, his daughter reached for Marcus's hand. Tears glistened beneath the parking lot lights. "I do not even know how to thank you," she said softly. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Just be with your father. That is enough." The ambulance pulled away moments later, leaving behind a silence that felt very different from the one inside the tavern earlier. Across the lot, Brad Collins shifted uncomfortably. The confidence that had filled him an hour ago seemed harder to find now. Several people who had laughed before were no longer meeting his eyes. Emily Foster watched the entire exchange carefully. As a reporter, she had learned to recognize moments that revealed character. What interested her was not that Marcus had helped someone. It was what happened before he helped. Most people in his position would have walked away. Many would have considered it justified. Yet Marcus had responded to humiliation with professionalism and concern for a complete stranger. Emily found herself wondering how many times that had happened throughout his life. Marcus, however, seemed unaware of the attention. He simply adjusted his damp jacket and started walking back toward the tavern entrance. His shoes splashed lightly through shallow puddles left by the afternoon rain. The night air had turned cooler, and the wet fabric clinging to his shoulders made him shiver slightly. He was tired. More than anything, he wanted to go home. He wanted to check on his mother, make sure she had remembered to take her evening medication, and spend a quiet hour watching television beside her before bed. But before he could reach the entrance, a voice called out from behind him. "Marcus!" He turned. Emily Foster stood a few feet away, holding her phone at her side. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade around them. "I remember your name," she said. "I covered one of your rescue operations years ago." Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Emily smiled. "Most people here have no idea who you are, do they?" Marcus glanced briefly toward the tavern and then back at her. A faint smile touched his face. "That is all right," he said. "People do not have to know my story." Emily studied him for a moment. Then she looked past him toward Brad Collins, who was still standing under the glow of the neon sign, suddenly looking far less certain than he had earlier. And deep down, she sensed the night was far from over. Marcus stood beneath the glow of the tavern sign for a moment, unsure why Emily's words lingered in his mind. Most people spent years trying to be noticed. Marcus had spent years learning how to live without recognition. It was easier that way. Easier to focus on what mattered. Easier to care for his mother without explaining his sacrifices to strangers. Easier to accept that life had taken him down a different road than the one he once imagined. The parking lot gradually returned to normal. Cars started leaving. Conversations resumed. The crowd that had gathered around the ambulance scene slowly dispersed into the cool evening air. Yet something had changed. People who had barely glanced at Marcus when he first arrived now nodded respectfully as they passed. A few even thanked him. Marcus responded with the same quiet politeness he offered everyone. He never seemed comfortable with praise. Emily noticed that too. She followed him toward the entrance, but stopped before going inside. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Marcus turned. "Sure. Why did you leave emergency medicine?" For a brief second, a shadow crossed his face. Not pain exactly. More like the weight of a memory he carried every day. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his damp jacket and looked toward the dark highway beyond the parking lot. "My mother needed me," he said simply. Emily waited, sensing there was more. Marcus smiled softly. "She spent her whole life taking care of me. When she got sick, it seemed fair to return the favor." The answer struck Emily harder than she expected. She had interviewed politicians, Athletes, celebrities, and executives. Most people needed several minutes to explain their sacrifices. Marcus needed only one sentence. Nearby, Brad Collins remained standing with a small group of friends. Earlier in the evening, he had been the center of attention. Now the conversation around him felt strained. A few people kept glancing toward Marcus. Others seemed uncomfortable discussing what had happened inside the tavern. Brad noticed it too. Every laugh sounded forced. Every attempt to restart the night's energy seemed to fall flat. For the first time, he felt like an outsider in his own crowd. Marcus pushed open the tavern door and stepped back inside. The warmth of the room washed over him. The baseball game still played on the television. Glasses still clinked behind the bar. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different. The stool where he had been sitting remained empty. The bartender immediately approached him. "Sir," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Marcus looked surprised. "For what?" The bartender lowered his eyes. "I should have said something earlier." Marcus studied him for a moment and then shook his head. "You do not owe me anything." The bartender swallowed hard. Somehow that response made him feel even worse. Marcus returned to his seat only long enough to finish the soda he had ordered. Then he reached for his wallet. Before he could pay, the bartender pushed the money back across the counter. "Tonight is on the house." Marcus started to protest, but the man insisted. Around the room, several patrons watched quietly. None of them knew that before the night was over, another unexpected moment would force everyone there to make a choice about the kind of people they wanted to be. The tavern gradually settled into an uneasy calm, but the energy in the room no longer resembled the careless mood that had existed earlier that evening. Marcus sat quietly at the end of the counter, his empty glass resting beside folded hands that showed years of hard work. The wetness on his jacket had begun to dry, leaving faint wrinkles across the fabric. Outside the large front windows, the parking lot shimmered beneath tall streetlights, their reflections stretching across patches of rainwater like ribbons of gold. For a few minutes nobody approached him. Nobody interrupted him. The noise of conversation returned in cautious waves, softer than before. Marcus welcomed the silence. It reminded him of late evenings at home when his mother would sit near the living room window and watch the neighborhood lights come on one by one. Those moments had become precious. Some nights, she remembered everything. Other nights, she looked at him with uncertainty, searching her own son's face for clues. Yet every morning he showed up again. Every day, he repeated the same patient routines. Every day, he chose love over frustration. The thought brought a small smile to his face. Across the room, Brad Collins sat alone now. One by one, the friends who had crowded around him earlier found reasons to leave. Some checked their phones. Others quietly paid their tabs and headed for the door. Brad barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on Marcus. The image would not leave his mind. The soaked jacket, the calm voice, the gratitude in the eyes of the elderly man's daughter. None of it fit the assumptions he had made. For years, Brad had moved through life convinced that confidence and authority earned respect. Tonight he had witnessed something different. Respect that could not be demanded. Respect that appeared naturally when character revealed itself. Emily Foster remained near a corner booth, reviewing notes on her phone. As a journalist, she often searched for dramatic moments. Yet what fascinated her most about Marcus was the absence of drama. He never tried to impress anyone. He never defended himself. He never reminded people of his accomplishments. He simply did what he believed was right and allowed others to draw their own conclusions. The realization felt strangely powerful. A server switched off one section of overhead lights as closing time approached. Shadows lengthened across the wooden floor. The jukebox fell silent. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clinked softly as employees finished cleaning for the night. Marcus stood and reached for his keys. He was ready to go home, ready to check on his mother and leave the evening behind. As he headed toward the exit, he paused briefly beside the front window. Rain clouds drifted slowly across the moonlit sky. For a moment he watched the quiet parking lot and listened to the faint sound of wind moving through nearby trees. The world outside seemed peaceful. Behind him, a chair scraped gently against the floor. Brad had risen from his seat. The former confidence in his posture was gone, replaced by hesitation. He took a slow breath and looked toward Marcus. The distance between them was only a few yards, yet crossing it suddenly seemed harder than anything he had done all night. Brad stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the man he had judged so quickly only hours earlier. The tavern had grown quiet enough that the faint buzz of the neon sign outside could be heard through the glass. Marcus remained near the entrance, keys in hand, unaware that nearly everyone still inside had noticed the tension hanging in the air. The bartender stopped wiping the counter. Emily Foster lowered her phone. Even the remaining customers seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Brad took a slow step forward, then another. The distance between them steadily disappeared. Earlier that night, he had crossed the room with complete confidence, convinced he understood exactly who Marcus was. Now he realized he had known nothing at all. Marcus turned when he heard footsteps approaching. His expression remained calm, neither welcoming nor defensive. He simply waited. Brad opened his mouth to speak, but the words refused to come. For perhaps the first time in years, he found himself struggling to explain his own behavior. Authority had always made difficult conversations easier. A badge gave people distance. It gave them excuses. Standing here as an ordinary man, he had neither. I heard what the paramedic said. Brad finally began. His voice sounded smaller than usual. About your work. Marcus nodded politely. That was a long time ago. Brad glanced toward the floor. Apparently, it mattered to a lot of people. Marcus did not answer. Silence settled between them. Not hostile silence. Just honest silence. The kind that left no place to hide. Across the room, Emily watched carefully. She had interviewed enough people to recognize the moment when pride collided with truth. Most chose pride. She was not entirely sure which choice Brad would make. Then something unexpected happened. A middle-aged man sitting near the window stood up. My wife survived a highway accident 8 years ago, he said quietly. Everyone turned toward him. He looked directly at Marcus. You were one of the EMTs who stayed with her until surgery. Marcus seemed surprised. I remember her. The man smiled. She still remembers you too. Before the moment could settle, another voice spoke up near the bar. An older woman slowly rose from her chair. You helped my grandson during an asthma emergency when he was 7. A third voice followed. Then a fourth. Story after story emerged from people who had quietly crossed paths with Marcus over the years. A teenage server revealed that Marcus regularly repaired broken equipment at the community center for free. A retired teacher explained how he delivered groceries during winter storms to elderly residents who could not drive. None of these stories had ever appeared online. None had earned recognition. Marcus had simply done them because someone needed help. Brad listened in stunned silence. Each new story felt like another piece of a puzzle falling into place. The man he had dismissed as unimportant had spent years making life better for people who could never repay him. Meanwhile, Brad could not stop replaying his own actions from earlier that evening. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Marcus shifted uncomfortably under the attention. Recognition clearly made him uneasy. He offered a modest smile and shook his head. Most people would have done the same thing. Several people laughed softly because everyone knew that was not true. Emily noticed something change in Brad's face then. The defensiveness disappeared. The excuses disappeared. All that remained was the realization that the strongest person in the room had never needed to prove it. The room remained still long after the last story was told. No one seemed eager to leave anymore. The tavern that had been filled with laughter at someone else's expense now felt transformed by something quieter and far more powerful. Marcus stood near the entrance looking almost embarrassed by the attention. He glanced toward the door again, as if hoping to slip away unnoticed. But before he could take another step, Brad Collins finally moved forward. Every eye in the room followed him. The sound of his shoes against the wooden floor seemed unusually loud in the silence. He stopped a few feet from Marcus and took a long breath. For a moment, it looked like he might lose his nerve. Then he spoke. I was wrong. The words landed with surprising weight. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. Brad kept his eyes on Marcus. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I looked at you and decided who you were. I thought I was being funny. I thought I was proving something. He shook his head slowly. The truth is, I embarrassed myself. Marcus remained quiet. Brad continued. Everything people have said tonight. Every story. Every person you helped. His voice tightened slightly. That should have told me what kind of man you are. But I never bothered to find out. The bartender leaned against the counter and folded his arms. Emily watched silently from her table. Nobody seemed interested in checking a phone or finishing a drink. The entire room had become focused on a single moment of honesty. Brad looked down briefly before lifting his eyes again. I cannot change what happened earlier. But I am sorry. The apology was simple. No excuses. No explanations. Just accountability. Marcus studied him for several seconds. Outside, wind rattled softly against the front windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, a refrigerator hummed quietly. The silence stretched long enough to make everyone wonder how he would respond. Then Marcus smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. Not the smile of someone who had won. It was the smile of someone who understood that carrying anger often hurts the person holding it. Thank you, he said. The answer surprised almost everyone. Brad looked stunned. That is it. Marcus shrugged lightly. What else would you like me to say? A few people laughed softly. The tension in the room eased for the first time all night. Brad blinked. You are not angry. Marcus looked toward the dark parking lot outside before answering. Life gave me enough reasons to be angry years ago. I discovered it was a heavy thing to carry around every day. The words settled over the room like a warm light. Brad lowered his head. For the first time that evening, his shoulders seemed lighter too. Emily quietly saved the notes on her phone. She had expected a story about conflict. Instead, she had witnessed something rarer. A story about grace. Marcus reached for the door handle again. This time nobody tried to stop him. But as he stepped outside into the cool night air, nearly every person in the tavern understood they had just seen a kind of strength that no badge, title, or position could ever provide. 3 months later, the memory of that night still lingered in the small town, though not for the reasons anyone would have expected. The story never became national news. No television crews arrived. No headlines chased attention across the internet. Instead, it spread the old-fashioned way. Through conversations at grocery stores. Through church gatherings on Sunday mornings. Through neighbors telling neighbors about the man who chose dignity when he had every reason not to. The leaves had begun changing color by then. Gold and amber covered the sidewalks beneath rows of maple trees. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn, and the community center on the east side of town bustled with activity. Children played basketball in the gymnasium. Seniors attended wellness classes. Volunteers packed food boxes for families who needed extra help. Near the entrance, Marcus Reed moved between rooms carrying supplies with the same quiet focus he brought to everything else. Nothing about his routine had changed. He still drove the same aging pickup truck. He still worked long hours. He still spent every evening caring for his mother. If anything, he seemed slightly uncomfortable whenever people brought up what had happened at the tavern. To Marcus, kindness was never a performance. It was simply a habit. Across the gymnasium, another volunteer lifted a stack of donation boxes onto a cart. Marcus glanced over and smiled. Brad Collins smiled back. The first few weeks had been awkward. Both men knew that. Trust was not something rebuilt in a single conversation. But Brad had kept showing up, week after week. Not because anyone forced him to. Not because he wanted recognition. Simply because he wanted to become a better man than the one he had been that night. Together they loaded supplies, organized donations, and helped families carry groceries to their cars. There was no audience. No applause. Just work. Honest work. Emily Foster occasionally stopped by the center as well. She had eventually written an article, but not the one people expected. The story was not about humiliation. It was not about conflict. It was about character. More specifically, the quiet kind of character that often goes unnoticed until life places it under a spotlight. The article ended with a single sentence she felt captured everything she had witnessed. Some people carry authority. Others carry humanity. Only one of those survives after the moment has passed. Late one afternoon, Marcus finished stacking the final box of canned food and stepped outside. The sun hung low above the horizon, bathing the parking lot in warm orange light. Nearby, Brad helped an elderly couple load groceries into their trunk. A little girl skipped across the sidewalk holding her mother's hand. Wind rustled through the trees, carrying scattered leaves across the pavement. For a moment, everything felt still, peaceful. Marcus leaned against the railing and watched the scene unfold. The world remained imperfect. People still made mistakes. They still judged too quickly. They still misunderstood one another. But sometimes people changed. Sometimes they listened. Sometimes they learned. Behind him, the community center doors opened and closed as families came and went. Laughter drifted into the evening air. Marcus took a slow breath and smiled. Not because justice had arrived with noise or punishment. Not because anyone had won. but because understanding had quietly taken root where judgment once stood, and beneath the fading sunlight, as neighbors helped neighbors, and the wind carried the sounds of ordinary kindness through the town, the silence that followed felt like the truest kind of victory.